My name's John Lynch. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Communication at the University of Cincinnati, and I am also involved with the Clinical Research Ethics Initiative for our joint Clinical and Translational Science Award with Cincinnati Children's Hospital.
Can you tell me a little bit about some of your current or recent research related to the rhetoric of science, technology, and medicine?
One of my biggest projects was out of my dissertation research. I worked on the American debates about embryonic stem cell research, and as part of that I looked at how those debates, especially the use of definition, changed across scientific, political, and journalistic contexts. So that has been a big part of my life for a while. And the other area where I've spent a good bit of time is in the public understanding of genomics, and that has led to a lot of my recent collaborative work with Cincinnati Children's Hospital around genomics and biobanking. So, and understanding public/community reactions to that sort of research and what they hope to get out of it in terms of immediate returns and sort of individual results, as well as learning about problems for the specific community.
Could you say a little bit more about the stem cell project?
So the title of the book is What Are Stem Cells? Definition at the Intersection of Science and Politics. It came out last year, October 2011, from the University of Alabama Press in the Rhetoric, Culture, and Critique book series. So as I mentioned, the book covers, looks at the debates and the use of definitions across multiple contexts, and is organized to look at strategies and how people create real definitions and comport them with the ideological values of the American public. So one of the main appeals for the research is the sort of argument to appeals that these are cures in potentia. They will cure, in some cases, everything except the common cold. Literally, that's about where they stop with that. And you get those sorts of definitions and some attempts at sort of counter definition, which are fairly unsuccessful. So then you get definitions from origin. These are embryos, or these are more specifically the murder of embryonic life. And that's the main countervailing strategy. And there's some intermediate strategies as well, defining different types of stem cells. They're embryonic and adult, and types of adult stem cells, which involves the use of argument from hierarchy to define different types.
Can you talk to us a little bit about what drew you into researching in this field, in the rhetoric of science?
Sometimes I'm not sure myself. When I think I really have to go back to almost sort of high school and even grade school. I was sort of interested in science. It was neat, but I really sucked at math. And so, and when the argument was, well, you know, it's all trigonometry and calculus, that was better than it being geometry, which I nearly failed twice. So, but still not exactly sort of reassuring me that science was where I needed to be going. So I was also into journalism. I was involved with the student newspaper. I'd been editor-in-chief for 2 years. So that's where I went first. Also had a love of music that was competing, and so I started doing a lot of outside of the department, outside of communication classes, and fell in love with philosophy as well. And out of that, I met a Pitt grad who became a faculty member at the University of Dayton, where I was going, who had done a lot of rhetoric and philosophy work, Wade Kenny, and he was my advisor for my honors thesis and had me look at sort of Heidegger and rhetoric. And out of that, we ended up doing communication technology stuff about voice replacements for the electronic larynx for people who've lost their larynx because of lung cancer and various cancers related to smoking. And so that got me interested in technology and science and medicine in a very sort of broad way. And when I went to Pittsburgh, then I started taking classes in the Rhetoric of Science with John Lynch and encountering those sort of scientific issues with a number of people in my cohort. And that's really where my interest in the Rhetoric of Science formed. Originally, I was thinking I'd do a dissertation on the gay gene, and then a directed study with Celeste Condit showed me that, pretty much most of the things about the gay gene have been said. So she said, you can do a dissertation, but you're gonna get like an article out of it. But there's this stem cell stuff some people over on the other campus are talking about. Why don't you go check it out? And I did, and the rest is history.
So what can you tell me about the history of ARST and your involvement with it? And in particular, we're looking for recall on sort of memorable moments at various meetings over the years.
I feel like I came into ARST in a period of relative quiet. Like long before I was there, like the entire drama about Dilip Gaonkar's article came and went. I think the most memorable ARST pre-conference I went to was when we invited Chris Mooney, author of The Republican War on Science, to come. And we had a long, rather involved discussion roundtable with him. I know like Celeste, John Campbell, Leah Ceccarelli, and John Lynch were all part of a long conversation about how ought we to be engaging with evolution deniers, intelligent design folks. And I think that conversation has led to a lot of what at our pre-conference this year was talked about as the more Isocratean vision of the Rhetoric of Science, where we aim to do more than just critique or to sort of pay homage at the altar of science and actually view this area as rhetoricians who need the help of a rhetor, of a teacher.
So it is the 20-year anniversary of ARST, sort of marking the consolidation of a field of research. For you, what are the significant tensions or intellectual sticking points that stand out over the last 20 years? And admittedly, that 20-year history surpasses your own involvement.
Yeah, fair enough. So I would say that there are at least two, and probably I'll find at least one more as I'm going forward here. The big one, especially when I was starting to learn about this field for a lot of people, was really still coming to terms with Gaonkar's article, The Idea of Rhetoric and the Rhetoric of Science. And because it had been republished in the book Rhetorical Hermeneutics along with a number of response essays, but you even had in those responses Alan Gross sort of copying in some way to all of the things, or this was the perception. He agreed with everything Gaonkar said, and we were pretty much just toast. What the hell were we doing? And that was the sort of fear that people were articulating. How can I do this work? Am I failing? If I mention something that sounds too much like ethos or pathos or logos, have I just really committed the same mistakes that Gaonkar blasted all these other people for? And on the one hand, personally, I didn't feel that sort of felt anxiety as much myself. Maybe I was just a little sort of deaf to all of the ramifications of it. I mean, I was just starting out, but there was still a great deal of concern and fear about, can we even talk about science from a rhetorical perspective? I mean, people went on to do it anyways, but they were very anxious about doing it and about their status within the field of rhetoric and the broader field of science studies. That anxiety has gone away, I think, for the most part. I think it got worked out through a lot of people's book-length projects. Jeannie Fanistock in Rhetorical Figures of Science Lisa Karenan's book sort of refigured ethos in a new key, turning to the work of Michael Hyde. And so people have realized that the rhetorical tradition is easily rehabilitated. Yeah, I'll stick with that. It's been easily rehabilitated once people put their minds to doing it. And so the fear that, oh God, I mentioned ethos, I'm just a sham, has faded. The other concern that I see animating us now is that more of us are turning to qualitative methods. We do it under the aegis of a little bit of McGee, a little bit of some of the more post-structuralist trends in the field. Everything can be a text, therefore we create our own texts. So people create texts out of interviews, out of archives, as well as looking at obvious material objects and material rhetoric. So people are beginning to use those methods to understand sort of public reception and public sort of ideological framing of issues. And I think that there's the fear now that we are beginning to lose the strong textual, maybe even sort of tradition for speech. What do we lose when we turn to doing interviews or ethnography or focus groups, especially if we begin collaborating with medical professionals? And that seems to be our current anxiety. And again, it's one that, doesn't animate me as much. And again, I admit maybe I'm deaf to it, but part of me is like, if we're creating texts, let's create texts. And if that means talking to people, God forbid, maybe rhetoricians should talk to people.
What are some other challenges that you see moving the field forward? What does the next 20 years look like for ARST?
While we still have to allow ourselves to be entangled in these maybe theoretical challenges and methodological challenges, part of me really wants to say that the big thing is publishing. Things have improved. There are more rhetorical studies of science, medicine, and technology being published. There are more book-length projects coming to publication. We need to maintain that. There have been times, I've seen whole cohorts of people who've gone through doing more rhetoric of science who haven't published that much. And while that makes sense in terms of if you are in a teaching or a very service-oriented department, yes, that's going to be hard to do. At the same time, if we want to make an effective argument for the centrality of our work, in the 21st century, science and medicine and technology are really important, and we really need to take those seriously and avoid the overt anti-science bias coming from some strains of critical theory. We need to be publishing. We need to be publishing in QJS a lot, more than we are now. We need to be publishing in Rhetoric and Public Address, Rhetoric Society Quarterly. We need to be in the main fields of our journal, even as we are publishing outside of our field in Public Understanding of Science, or Science, Technology, and Human Values, or even things like Clinical Pediatrics, where I have a piece. Yes, reach out, but also make sure you are bringing the message back home.
So you talked a bit about the central argument of your book, What Are Stem Cells? Can you talk about what you see as your biggest contribution to the field of rhetoric of science and technology, and connect it to some of the broader themes that have animated the research in the field over the last couple decades?
I'd like to sort of pimp out the book a little bit, but at the same time, I think people, where I see people sort of citing me the most is an article I published in the Quarterly Journal of Speech in 2009 that offered a framework for looking at the rhetoric sort of in science, rhetoric produced by scientific rhetors, and how do we account for the materiality of that work. We've often taken more of a Ciceronian approach in the field. If we haven't gone sort of full sophist like Alan Gross circa 1990, we're much more sort of a Ciceronian approach. There's this materiality, it's sort of like the boundary condition for what we do, instead of considering how we work with, shape, reshape the materiality as it simultaneously works on us. So I talk about these sort of registers of scientific activity, and that it occurs in three. The material register, sort of a social organizational register where economic concerns are also prevalent, and then a rhetorical register. And all of those overlap and interanimate one another. And I use that to take a second look at Dean Hamer's article from 1993 in Science that argued for the existence of a gay gene, and talk about, especially in sort of contrast to the work of Robert Brookie on that this is not just a reiteration of Freudian blame the mother, but rather a flawed argument that is based in the limited tools that were available for that type of genetic analysis in the late 80s and early 90s, and the tools that were used to try and paper over the limitations of scientific method at that time. And so people have taken the idea of registers or responding to materiality and run with it and done very different things with it. And so I like the fact that people recognize that and are trying to account for materiality, even as they might not take up what I've suggested fully. But it seems that that has become at least a warrant, and I hope something more than just a warrant for doing their own work.
What does rhetoric add to studies of science and technology and medicine?
I think it adds back people. So often when I talk to individuals doing qualitative research of medicine or science, and I'm usually thinking of people who are in medical humanities departments or bioethics departments in hospitals, the human element seems to be missing. They realize, oh, we should talk to people or stuff like that, but they don't really consider the words that people are using. They abstract it into a position or a group message. And in our engagements with those audiences that are on medical campuses and are at teaching colleges, those are benefits that we can bring to the table. In terms of our interaction with history and philosophy, I think I would sort of default to some of the arguments offered by John Lynch and David Depew that our ability to look at context and invention are the distinctive offering there. Though at the same time, maybe it's because we don't have a very strong history and philosophy of science program at UC, but part of me is like, forget them. If they don't want us in their sandbox, well, there's a bigger one that we can go play in as well, and we can do some really good work that reaches past just the boundaries of our field. Even as we need to be grounded in the field of rhetorical studies and communication writ large, we are able to engage those medical and scientific audiences, those practitioners who recognize that they need help in engaging people.
I wonder if I could invert that question and ask you, how does science as a context add to the study, or what does science as a context add to the study of rhetoric? Or to kind of repeat a theme from yesterday, how might rhetoric of science contribute to rhetorical theory more generally?
I think we can serve a sort of melioristic function in terms of helping people be less afraid of science. There is a strong anti-science bias that is driven partly by some of the epistemic arrogance of scientists, but I think it's also much more reflective of disciplinary politics in our institutions, and recognizing that scientists are not all evil. Scientists really do want to understand what's going on, what people are concerned about, is worthwhile. Although I guess I should also note that, I'm really talking in a biomedical context when I speak that way. The physicists and geologists that I've met are not as concerned, but they're also not mostly doing environmental studies either, which is, again, another place where I think there's much more desire for interaction with publics.
So you're working with clinicians, you're working with people on the ground. Is that the telos of your work? The ultimate purpose is to inform medical practice at some level? Who's the audience? Who's the primary audience for your work? Or
I think
different audiences?
I think I really do have different audiences at different moments or different places in my work. So I do want to reach a broadly rhetorical, an audience of rhetorical scholars, and engage them and highlight the sort of how theory can be shaped and reinforced, reinvigorated by the encounter with science, and to get people to recognize how central these scientific issues are to our lived experience, even as something as mundane as the architecture of this building. The decisions that are involved there are very important. Recognizing those background decisions that aren't always put on display on the podium, and how they shape who we are and what we do is really important. At the same time, clinical audiences do need to hear from us as well. They recognize in one moment that they do need help reaching out to people, and then can be a little bit tone deaf then again a moment after that. And it's sort of using a relationship with them to encourage better interaction or reformulate a context or situation where decisions are required of patients or assent is required. And sometimes occasionally hitting them over the head. Don't forget about asking people what they really want.
So what are the future directions, either in terms of topics or methods, that you see for research in the rhetoric of science, technology, and medicine?
I think methodologically we need to continue producing work, and most likely it'll be book length or multiple article work that combines methods, combines the ethnography or the interview and the focus group with the textual approaches that we have perfected over at least the existence of our discipline in the United States, if not the entire rhetorical tradition writ large. So as we do more of that work, I think our current anxieties about methodology will work themselves out as we see the practical and effective application of these methods, and how they fit within the larger ethos of the rhetorical tradition and the ethos of rhetorical scholarship at this point in time.
Biomedicine seems to be a kind of twist or evolution of rhetoric of science. I mean, we have more people identifying as rhetoric of medicine or rhetoric of biomedicine. What do you see as the most pressing issues there? Is there a particular, more specific research agenda that you might suggest pursuing?
There are so many different angles, different approaches. My research in biomedicine is focused on the research setting and not so much the clinical encounters or the sort of policies for healthcare management. And I mean, there are so many. The implications of healthcare reform are going to be ongoing and multiple. It's so huge that, people can spend their lifetime sort of working through what all of this will mean. There are other very clinical issues in terms of patient care that I'm sure are really important, and that I don't think anyone can go wrong sort of looking at biomedicine generally. There are so many topics, there are so many different ways to sort of carve the joint that this is going to be a very productive area for a long time to come. I think the trick is to make sure that we do not slight the other areas that we talk about. We talk about rhetoric of science, rhetoric of medicine, and rhetoric of technology. And we're more and more, I think, younger scholars are doing rhetoric of medicine, not entirely, but to a large measure. And I think rhetoric of technology has been slighted, or it ends up getting sort of combined with media ecology and media studies. And rhetoric of science, and thinking about physics and geology and the other disciplines that, scientific disciplines we could examine that would be key to understanding climate change, energy. All of those are important, but they tend to fall into environmental rhetoric at the moment. And both of those are good areas, but even as we focus more on medicine, we need to, I think, be mindful of trying to encourage those who, medicine's not their bag. They want to do rhetoric of physics. Okay, good. How can we make sure that we keep these other areas alive and don't let them die on the vine in our rush to go to an area which I like because, that's where I'm working, but other people might not be as excited about. So the balance issue is going to be a challenge for us as a collective.
So the last question I've been asking people is, what advice would you give to young people in the rhetoric of science, technology, and medicine as they start their career? What served you well?
You need to develop a very strong connection with your advisor. You need to develop good relationships across the field, and you need to be actively writing all the time. I know that sounds almost silly, but it's very easy to get wrapped up in other things that are going on within the field. With our pedagogy, which is important, but the writing, and hopefully also publishing, but that writing is what's going to really sort of most intimately shape your teaching contributions as well as the service that you end up providing to the discipline and at other various areas. So just write, write, write.